Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing NHL Award Predictions. So right off the bat, we have the Hart Memorial Trophy. This is the award given to the who is deemed to be the MVP in the league. So basically, which team has the most valuable player, and the three nominees are McDavid, Sidney Crosby, and Nikita Kucherov. Personally, I still go by the fact that I don't think a non-playoff player can be the MVP. I mean, realistically, how can you be the most valuable player on a team that isn't valuable at all? That's what the Oilers are. The Oilers missed the playoffs, and while McDavid is likely still the best player in the league, and you know, as soon as the Oilers actually make it back to the playoffs, he's likely a lock for the Hart Memorial. At this point, I don't see how they can give it to him, so that excludes him. Sidney Crosby had a solid year all around, was very good for the Penguins, helped them get to the playoffs, even though they ended up getting swept by the Islanders. But Nikita Kucherov had an insane season, the best season in the salary cap era of the NHL, over 120 points if I'm not mistaken, just an insane amount of points. So even though they got swept in the first round of the playoffs, the Hart Memorial Trophy and most of these trophies do not take into account playoff performances, and as such, even though Nikita Kucherov was on a very stacked Tampa team, he was so far ahead of the rest of the team that he will likely win the Hart Memorial in my eyes. Next is the Calder, with the award given to the league's best rookie, the nominees being Jordan Binnington, goaltender for the Blues, defenseman Rasmus Dahlin, as well as Elias Pettersson. So Jordan Binnington, I don't feel like played enough games. Again, playoff performance not taken into account here. So while Binnington was very good for the Blues during the regular season, I just don't think it's enough games. Dahlin was good for the Buffalo Sabres, especially as a teenage defenseman. But I mean, Elias Pettersson, even though he's a couple years older than Dahlin, was, you know, a step above basically every rookie, just putting up tons of points for a pretty poor Vancouver team. So I feel like he will get the Calder Memorial. Next is the Vezina Trophy, the award given to the league's best goaltender. This award, contrary to most of the others, is chosen by the GMs, not by just the media or NHL media or whatever. The awards being Ben Bishop, Robin Lehner, as well as Andrei Vasilevskiy. Ben Bishop, he had a very good year, but I just don't know if there were enough games for him to actually get the award. It'll be close, honestly, between him and Andrei Vasilevskiy, who I do believe will win, especially with how fantastic the Lightning played. You know, Vasilevskiy, we saw there was a stint with the Lightning where they had to play with Domingue due to an injury to Vasilevskiy, and while the Lightning were still winning the majority of their games, you saw that Domingue's stats really weren't all that good. So even though the Lightning are a stacked team and they could likely they could likely still make the playoffs with a goaltender like Domingue being their starter, it did show that Vasilevskiy was still a very strong goaltender. Now, when it comes to Robin Lehner as a candidate, I'm not too sure why that is the case. I mean, Lehner did not play a lot of games, but Bishop is in the same boat. But the reason that Bishop didn't play a lot of games is because of injury, while Robin Lehner was basically splitting time with Thomas Greiss. And, you know, one flu bug here or there for Robin Lehner and having him miss like 2-3 games could have basically turned the tides of the whole season for the Islanders and had Thomas Greiss be the starter come playoff time. And so Robin Lehner's stats were very good, but Thomas Greiss's stats were also very good, which basically tells me that it was mostly the Islanders as a core unit that really helped out their goaltending more so than it was Robin Lehner carrying this team to the playoffs. So I think it's unfair if Robin Lehner were, let's say, to win the Vezina while Thomas Greiss has to sit at home, having done almost as much as, you know, Lehner had to put in effort to get the Islanders to where they were. And yet he's getting all the credit and Greiss gets nothing for it. So I don't think Robin Lehner should have been nominated. I think Vasilevskiy will win this award, but I think Ben Bishop will come close. Next is the James Norris, the award given to the league's best defenseman, nominees being Victor Hedman, Brent Burns, as well as Mark Giordano. I think Victor Hedman is sort of an odd inclusion here. He had a solid season, got injured for a couple of games. I don't think he's going to be very close to this top two. The real battle is between Brent Burns and Mark Giordano, and I do think Mark Giordano will edge out Brent Burns, mostly because of the fact that Mark Giordano does have the narrative. It was a big storyline that Mark Giordano would end up winning the Norris early on this season. He's something like 35 years old, so he's almost like due. Brent Burns already has a Norris and everything like that, and Giordano, you know, credit to him, of course, still has to go. he's a very, very good defenseman, as well as the fact that he put up a ton of points. So while he wasn't Brent Burns' 83 points in 82 games, Giordano put up a respectable amount, somewhere around 70, that should allow him to still be able to claim this trophy, but Brent Burns will indeed keep it close. And of course, if playoff performance was taken into account, I would assume Brent Burns would end up winning it, but that is not the case here. So Giordano should get his first Norris. Brent Burns might have to wait to get his second. Next is the Selke Trophy, the award given to the forward who is the best at defense, I guess. The best defensive forward would be the best way to put it. Usually called the Patrice Bergeron Trophy, but maybe not this year. Nominees being Mark Stone, Patrice Bergeron, and Ryan O'Reilly. So the Selke was an interesting trophy this year because besides Patrice Bergeron, who is basically a staple, players like Andrei Kopitar, Alexander Barkov, Sean Couturier, other, normal names to find in the Selke didn't make the playoffs and weren't particularly that stand out, I guess. Couturier was still very good, Barkov was still fantastic, but they didn't make the playoffs, so they didn't end up getting up for the Selke Award. Mark Stone is a winger, so it's pretty rare to see a winger up for the Selke. Normally it's an award given to the center because the center has a lot more defensive duties as a forward group, while the wingers usually play a bit more up, but Mark Stone obviously has the takeaways. But I think Mark Stone spent a bit too much time with Ottawa this season, and the fact that he's a winger, I don't think he'll actually end up coming too close to this top two, which I believe will be Bergeron and O'Reilly. Mark Stone, nice to see the nomination there, but I don't think he'll get much further. Bergeron, of course, had a fantastic season. I think in any normal season, he'd probably get the victory here, but he got injured, didn't play 17 games, so I think that will hurt his chances and will be the reason why Ryan O'Reilly comes out on top for the Selke win, which I think would be his first of his career, if I'm not mistaken. O'Reilly had a very good season. Even when the Blues were struggling heavily, O'Reilly was basically the one shining bright spot on that team. He also helped them recover from their last place in the NHL in early January, so a very good season for Ryan O'Reilly. He's also sort of due for a Selke, and because of Patrice Bergeron's injury this season, I think he will manage to get it. Next is the Lady Byng, which is a trophy rewarded to the player who exemplifies the most sportsmanship on the ice. Basically, the player who puts up the most points with also the least amount of penalty minutes. Nominees being Sean Monahan, Ryan O'Reilly, and Alexander Barkov. When it comes to Sean Monahan, he basically had the same amount of penalty minutes as I believe O'Reilly, but with less points, so I don't see why Monahan would get it. I think less points. O'Reilly will come close, and he has won the Lady Byng before, but I think it'll go to Barkov. Barkov had so many more points, had less minor penalties. I don't even think this is going to be particularly close. Barkov will win it by a long shot, and the Lady Byng is a award that doesn't really care about whether or not you made the playoffs compared to, let's say, the Hart, the Vezina, the Norris. It's normally playoff defensemen, playoff goaltenders, playoff players for the MVP. For the Lady Byng, it doesn't really matter, and that's why I think Barkov can get the victory there. The Jack Adams is next, the award given to the best coach of the year, normally given to the coach who basically takes his team and surprises compared to most predictions. That's normally who it is given to. Nominees being Craig Berube, John Cooper, as well as Barry Trotz. Now, Berube, of course, did some great things with St. Louis. They started off very poorly with Mike Yeo, and then Craig Berube takes over, and while it was a bit of a slow transition, he ended up turning that team around, and of course, with what we know now, he's obviously done a fantastic job with the Blues, but from what we knew then, from when we just saw them make the playoffs third in the Central Division, I don't think Berube did some sort of miraculous thing. I think Mike Yeo was so bad of a coach for the St. Louis Blues that he basically brought a team that should have already been, let's say, a third or even higher competitive team in the Central Division. He brought them down, and Berube basically just brought them back up to the level they should have been at. So I think it's impressive, but I don't think it's some incredibly impressive feat that he managed to pull off. I think the real race is between John Cooper and Barry Trotz. Now, normally Barry Trotz would likely win hands down for what he did with the Islanders. He basically showed up there for his first year after coming off of a Stanley Cup. Everyone counted out the Islanders because of a weak roster on paper, but he managed to bring them to second place in the Metropolitan Division in a fantastic year. Their goaltending was superb. The defense that was the worst in the league, or one of the worst in the league the previous year, ended up being one of the best in the league this year. even with sort of similar staff. So he did a very good job with the Islanders. The only reason why it's not hands down is because John Cooper, not only did he have a great year with the Lightning, he had a historic year with the Lightning, getting over 60 wins. It was absolutely fantastic. And just counting the regular season, the Tampa Bay Lightning were clearly the best team in the league for those 82 games. So Cooper will come really, really close, but I do think Barry Trotz, because of the whole narrative of the fact that this was his first year with the Islanders and he's coming off of a Stanley Cup, I do think he'll get the win. If, let's say, this was the Islanders' third year and they were expected to be bad once again, but they managed to turn it around, I think John Cooper would get the edge over Trotz. But because of the first-year fact, Trotz should get the Jack Adams. Finally, the GM of the Year award. This is the only award on this board that is actually voted for at the end of the second round of the playoffs instead of at the end of the regular season. So that is why the three nominees were three of the four conference final teams: Don Waddell, Don Sweeney, and Doug Armstrong. The only conference final GM who's not nominated for the GM of the Year was Doug Wilson, which I found very odd since he probably made the biggest move of any of those four GMs, which was acquiring Erik Karlsson, which certainly helped the Sharks get to where they were. So I was extremely surprised to not see Doug Wilson nominated for this award. But Don Waddell, I can't see winning the award. He obviously made some pretty big moves and it ended up working out for the Hurricanes, but I feel like it was a lot of the wrong things that somehow ended up working right. I mean, he didn't solve their goaltending issue. He picked up, I believe, Mrazek and McElhinney, and that ended up working out for him, but I don't think that really solved his issue, and we saw that in the series against the Boston Bruins where it did not work out at all. I think the Skinner trade was terrible. I mean, they traded a 40-goal scorer for basically spare parts, and then the Dougie Hamilton and Michael Ferland trade for Elias Lindholm and Noah Hanifin, I also don't really like. Hamilton, wasn't something that they didn't already have. I mean, Justin Falk does a decent job, and while Hamilton is of course better than Justin Falk, I don't think it's massively better. And Ferland was basically just for a single year, and he's not normally the type of player you would get for a single year to make a huge impact. So I think a lot of the Hurricanes and Don Waddell's moves should probably not have worked out, but they did. So, credit, I guess, goes to him that it ended up working. I think a lot of credit has to go to Rod Brind'Amour mostly over Don Waddell, but because the Jack Adams field was so stacked this year, he doesn't end up getting the credit as a nomination. Don Sweeney, while he didn't make as many big moves as the other two GMs, while Sweeney's work was more over time, this year he did make a couple of decent ones, picking up Charlie Coyle and Marcus Johansson near the trade deadline were obviously huge moves that get the Boston Bruins to where they are at the moment, which is the Stanley Cup Finals. So have to give Don Sweeney credit for that. However, I just don't think the moves were, big enough to really make a huge splash to get over who I have winning, Doug Armstrong, the GM of the St. Louis Blues. Now, Armstrong made a ton of moves during the offseason. He acquired Ryan O'Reilly in a fantastic trade, obviously gave up a first-round pick, which is normally what it's going to take to get a player like O'Reilly, but also gave up a couple of big contracts like Patrick Berglund, who didn't end up playing past December for the Sabres, Sobotka, who wasn't that great for the Blues in the first place, Tage Thompson, who wasn't really that great of a prospect either for the Blues. And so this was a very good trade, easily won by the Blues for O'Reilly. He also made solid signings like Tyler Bozak, maybe a bit expensive, but he's been very good for them. Patrick Maroon, not like a fantastic player or anything, but still a solid depth signing. David Perron, bringing him back on a pretty solid deal, was very good for them. And so the Blues just doing a lot of things. You could give the same criticism to him as I did with Waddell, that he didn't really solve the goaltending issue for them, and he sort of just fell backwards into Jordan Binnington because he once again depended on Jake Allen, and he was once again mostly disappointed. Luckily for him, Binnington was there to save the day and to help him get this nomination for GM of the Year, but I do think a lot of the other things he did during the offseason really helped, and while I don't know if he would actually win it over Doug Wilson in my eyes, if Wilson was nominated, the fact that that didn't happen should get the award pretty much hands down, I'd say. It could be rather close between him and Sweeney, but I think Armstrong will get it and end up getting 2 awards for the St. Louis Blues during this award ceremony, and potentially even a Stanley Cup for them as well. But that will do it for these award predictions. There are a couple other trophies, obviously, like the Masterton. There's also the Lester B. Pearson, which is basically going to the league's best player, which is normally McDavid, but it might be Kucherov this year. But those trophies I don't think are as interesting to predict as these 8, and so I felt the need to just exclude them in this video. Class dismissed.